In this New World Aeternum Void Gauntlet build and weapon guide, we're going to be covering the Void Gauntlet. This weapon scales with both intelligence and focus, meaning that you'll likely pair it with another intelligence scaling weapon, but that you could also pair it with a focus weapon like a life staff or Flail and Shield if you wish. It's one of two weapons in the game that can deal void damage, with the Great Axe being the other one, but this weapon deals exclusively void damage, which is good against Ancients, which is a group of enemies in the game, but is terrible against the Lost, which many enemies are early on in the game. So your damage with this weapon is going to be kind of bad early on, but it'll be better later on. Heavy attacks with this weapon not only pass through the target, capable of hitting multiple enemies at once, but they also heal you for 20% of the weapon damage, although you can only get this healing once per heavy attack, so you're not going to heal for every enemy hit. Additionally, holding block with this weapon converts your health to mana, and this allows you to use your abilities more often and is really good for builds that might use two weapons that use mana. For instance, if you paired this with Ice Gauntlet, or Fire Staff, or Life Staff, any of those three weapons also use mana, and you have a shared mana pool. So this is a great weapon, whether you're using it as your primary or secondary weapon, in order to allow you to get your mana back quickly. Additionally, another really good option could be to pair it with something like the Flail and Shield, which also scales with focus, and then you could use the Void Gauntlet to regain mana at the cost of your health, and then swap to the Flail and Shield and use some of its abilities that don't cost mana, but that also heal you to regain your health back, and then swap back and vice versa. And this weapon also, just like the Ice Gauntlet and Fire Staff and Life Staff, doesn't cost mana in order to use your light and heavy attacks. You can always use these no matter what, but the spells do cost mana, as I mentioned, so you'll have to pay attention to that. And as I also mentioned, you have a shared mana pool when you pair this with the Fire Staff, Life Staff, or Ice Gauntlet, so you may or may not want to do that depending. But if you are going to pair, any of those weapons, this is a great weapon to do it with because you can regain mana so easily. So the pros of this weapon are that it can be used at range or in melee. Void damage is good against almost any enemy type in the game except the ones found at the beginning of the game. It can restore mana easily, and it can heal while attacking. The cons of this weapon are that it has lower damage than some weapons, and void damage is very bad early on in the game. So the two skill trees for the Void Gauntlet are Annihilation, which deals primarily with increasing your damage and getting critical hits, while the Decay skill tree focuses on debuffing the enemy, dealing damage over time, and also healing yourself. So the first ability in the Annihilation tree is called Petrifying Scream. This ability doesn't deal a ton of damage, but it kind of shoots out like a wave in a short distance in front of you that does some damage and also roots enemies in place. This is obviously best against multiple enemies and using it on enemies that are grouped up to get most effect. And this can be great in PvE, but I think it's even better in PvP, where you can group up a group of players. Like if you're doing medium to large scale battles, you can root them all in place, so your ranged players can nuke them down, or maybe your Great Axe and Great Sword users can AoE them. Upgrading the skill will increase the duration of the root against low health targets, and will also give you Fortify for hitting multiple enemies. So the next skill in this tree is called Void Blade, and what this does is it actually swaps your weapon into a melee blade that allows you to melee attack with light and heavy attacks, with the light attack dealing 100% damage and the melee attack doing 150% damage. And this is a great skill because it gives you the option for melee if you don't have one. For instance, if your other weapon is like the Ice Gauntlet or Fire Staff or Life Staff, then you don't have a melee option. But with this, you'd still have a melee option, and you could use it at ranged as well. And on top of that, it also does Disintegrate with each hit, and that deals 5% of your weapon damage every second, along with applying a stacking debuff that reduces the target's armor. So that's just really good in general. Upgrading this weapon skill will provide you with Fortify, make it so that the skill has more critical damage when meleeing, and also so that you heal health based on your weapon damage for each stack of Disintegrate on the target. And the last skill in this tree is called Oblivion. This puts an AoE down on the ground where you're standing that not only deals damage to enemies standing in it, but also buffs you within power, increasing your damage and the damage of allies while they're standing in it. And this is really good for both PvE and PvP. This is great for like dungeons, for instance, or expeditions where you're grouped up on a boss or on a group of enemies, like during a trash pull, to be able to buff your teammates and deal damage, or in PvP where you're fighting like multiple enemies at the same time. And upgrading the skill will make it so that targets attacked inside this radius will be weakened, reducing their damage, and also increases the stamina regeneration of friendlies by 25% while they're inside it. So the capstone skill for this tree is called Void Caller, and essentially what it does is it makes it so that whenever you use a Void Gauntlet ability, not a regular attack, but an ability, you're going to gain 1 stack of Void Essence, and when you reach 6 stacks, you're going to create an aura around yourself that deals damage to hostile enemies, and heals you and friendlies inside of it for 5 seconds. And this healing of this skill focuses with focus, so if you go the focus route, this will be better. Essentially, that's what it does, and since you have 3 skills on your bar, you're essentially talking about 2 rotations of those skills before this would trigger, generally. And I think this one is much better in a dungeoning scenario where you're going to have friendly players grouped up on you, or maybe in group PvP where you might have other friendlies stacked on top of you and other players stacked on top of you where you can deal lots of damage and heal friendlies at the same time. So moving to the Decay skill tree, the first ability here is called Orb of Decay, and this shoots out an unblockable orb in front of you that also applies Disintegrate on targets, dealing damage over time and reducing their armor, and it also deals increased damage against AI-controlled enemies, so not players. And then when it comes back, it's going to heal you and friendlies every second for 5 seconds. So it not only deals damage, but it simultaneously heals, and it can't be blocked, which I think is worth noting because I think a lot of people are going to be using a shield if you're talking about PvP purposes in New World Aeternum, simply because of the amount of people using ranged weapons and the lock-on feature being added. Upgrading the skill will provide you with mana for each enemy hit, will also slow the targets, which is great, preventing them from escaping or getting to you. And the final upgrade will also allow you to detonate this ability for increased damage or increased healing, depending on where the orb is. The next ability in the skill tree is called Baleful Tether, and essentially what you do is you fire off a projectile that links you and an enemy together, unless it's blocked, of course. And this will empower you, increasing your damage, and weaken them, reducing the damage that they deal as long as you stay within range of the tether. Otherwise, it will break. Upgrading this skill line will make it so that hitting the target you tethered will reduce other Void Gauntlet cooldowns by 5% for each hit. It will also make it so you increase your mana regeneration by a whopping 200% when this is active. And it will also make it so that you heal yourself once the tether ends. This is an extremely strong skill, whether it's in PvE, fighting tough bosses, like in dungeons or just out on the landscape, or when fighting players on the landscape, particularly in 1v1 situations, where you can basically just keep using this on the same player over and over. And the last active skill in this skill tree is Essence Rupture, and this essentially deals damage to the target, but also makes it so that when any player hits that target for 10 seconds, they're also going to heal themselves for 20% of the damage they deal, which can be great, again, in like dungeons and PvE where you throw it on a boss, your teammates are healing themselves, or maybe in PvP where you're fighting like a single target, like one-on-one, where you can heal yourself through attacking that target. Upgrading this ability makes it so that when other players hit the target, they also regenerate 15 stamina per hit, and also so that if the target dies or the effect ends, you heal friendly allies within a 4-meter radius for a good amount of healing. The capstone for this skill tree is called Glimpse the Void, and just like the other capstone, it makes it so that when you use an ability, you gain a stack of Void Essence. But in this case, once you gain 4 stacks, if you use a successful heavy attack, you will then reset the cooldown of all your Void Gauntlet skills. This is actually a fantastic capstone, but you have to use it properly, and the best way to do that is effectively use 1 full rotation of your skills, and then when your 4th ability comes off cooldown, you use it, and then quickly use your other 2 abilities once they're off cooldown, and then do your heavy attack and repeat this. If you use the heavy attack right when that 4th ability is cast, you're only probably going to have a few seconds left of your abilities anyway, and you're kind of wasted. So you definitely want to make sure you get through 2 rotations of abilities, unless you're weaving in a lot of light attacks in there and your rotation is all staggered. But if you're just like blowing through your skills, then theoretically you would want to get through 2 rotations and then use this. And I think this capstone is better for solo questing or maybe 1v1 PvP, simply because the other capstone affects multiple enemies and also affects multiple players, where this one does not. So talking a little bit about weapons and armor, we've kind of covered this a little bit, but generally speaking, you're going to try and pair with something that's intelligence or focus scaling. If you're leaning more into healing, you're going to go focus and do life staff or flail and shield. The upside of life staff is that you can regain your mana easily with a Void Gauntlet, like if you want to continue healing or something, so the Void Gauntlet could be a great off weapon for a healer, whereas the Flail and Shield doesn't cost any mana to use its skills, so you can use them while your mana is replenishing and then switch to Void Gauntlet if you're having mana issues. Obviously, if you're using Fire Staff or Ice Gauntlet and you're going the intelligence route, you're going to have a shared mana pool and you're going to have to regain your mana a lot more often. You might go through health pots a lot more often, or you might want to use Void Gauntlet healing abilities more than you would if you were maybe not using one of those 2 weapons as your backup weapon. Now for armor, it really depends on what you're trying to do. I'm going to recommend light armor for most cases because it increases your damage, and theoretically if you're using 2 ranged weapons like a Fire Staff or an Ice Gauntlet as a backup to this, or even Life Staff, you're not going to be trying to get hit, you're going to be trying to stay at range. However, if you decide to use the melee attack of the Void Gauntlet, and you're going to engage in that a lot. You might want to consider medium or heavy armor for more protection. If you get, heavy armor, you're going to do less damage, but you'll be harder to kill. If you use medium armor, you'll be somewhere in the middle. So I think if you plan on meleeing at all with a Void Gauntlet, that you should probably go medium armor. If you plan on meleeing it with a lot, you might want to go heavy. If you don't plan on using that melee at all, then definitely go light. So that wraps up our Void Gauntlet build and weapon guide. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. Will you be using the Void Gauntlet at launch, or will you be playing with some other weapon? Let me know in the comments below.